G'day! Today we're going to check out the life of Sappho. Let's get into it. Pretty much everything we know about the most famous lady poet from ancient times comes from papyrus scraps pulled out of Egyptian rubbish dumps. No exaggeration there. Sappho of Lesbos, who Plato called the 10th muse, wrote around 10,000 lines of poetry that shaped Western lit for ages. Only about 650 lines are left. Those lines got lost from age, religious nutters, and that awkward fact that later scribes found her dialect too hard to copy. But the bits that survived are so powerful that scholars spent years piecing them together from old rubbish. Those scholars nearly went blind from the work, and one even had a bit of a meltdown for a while. These weren't just poems, they gave us a peek into a whole world. In that world, a woman's voice carried as much weight as Homer's. Love between women was celebrated openly, not hidden, and personal stuff became universal through language so sharp it still cuts deep 2,600 years later. Lesbos is in the northeast Aegean, so close to the coast of Asia Minor that on a clear day you can spot the other side. Around 630 BC, maybe a bit earlier, a girl was born on the island to a well-off family, her name, Sappho. The exact year's still up for debate. Some reckon she was born between 650 and 640 BC, others say around 630. What's more certain is she lived through major political drama and came from a rich family. She was so famous that cities minted coins with her face on them. Her mum's supposed to have been called Cleis, though old scholars might have guessed that from the name of Sappho's daughter. As for her dad, old records give 10 different possibilities. All those names suggest something important. Sappho never brought him up in her poetry. The most likely bloke is Scamandronymus, a successful wine merchant. Back in ancient Greece, the wine trade was mega profitable, giving you connections and influence, the kind of dough that could pay for a daughter's schooling when most women only learned weaving and running a house. Sappho also had 3 brothers, Charaxos, Larichos, and Eurykos. We've got info on the first 2. Those brothers show up in a poem dug up in 2014 from another stash of old papyrus. More on that soon. The middle brother, Charaxos, apparently fell head over heels for an Egyptian courtesan called Rhodopis and blew a fortune to buy her freedom. The whole thing caused a scandal in the family, and Sappho wrote a poem giving her brother a serve over his choices. Seems like even 2,600 years ago, poets were writing about their messed up families. The island where Sappho grew up was anything but peaceful. Back in the 7th century BC, Lesbos was caught up in factional fighting between posh clans. These weren't just small arguments. They were nasty power battles that led to exiles, property being taken, and the odd murder. Sappho's family was mixed up in it, but we're not sure which side they were on. But most experts reckon they backed a faction against the tyrant Pythagoras. He's remembered as one of the 7 sages of Greece, a popular leader who pushed for frugality and reforms. He had his eyes on those old wealthy families who'd got rich through wine, trade, and land. As for Sappho's family, between 604 and 595 BC, she was forced into exile. According to the Parian Chronicle, the only old record we've got for this, she was in Sicily back then. Imagine being torn away like that, a Sheila brought up in the lap of luxury, soaking up culture and music. She had to leave everything she knew behind because of political dramas she couldn't control. Over the other side of the Med, Sicily was a completely different world from Lesbos. What she got up to over there, how she got by, or whether she wrote anything well, history's dead quiet on that. But being exiled definitely shaped her. You can't be away from home for years without it changing how you see things. Eventually, she headed back to Lesbos once the political scene had settled. Coming back to Mytilene, the main town on the island, she picked up where she left off. But what did that life really involve? This is where things get tricky, because centuries of guesswork and romanticizing have muddied the little evidence we've got left. The Suda, a Byzantine dictionary from around the 10th century, reckons Sappho was married to a bloke named Hercules from Andros. Modern scholars reckon this was a joke. Hercules is a smaller version of Herkos, which can mean Willie. Andros, besides being an island, comes from Arna, the Greek word for man, so the name basically means dickhead. An old comic poet probably cooked this up from the Isle of Man, and later sources took it as gospel. For ages, Sappho's so-called hubby Dick from Man was repeated as real history. This is important because it shows just how much later generations either misunderstood or deliberately twisted Sappho's identity. They needed her to fit the mold. A married lady, a mum, someone proper. Her poetry was way too good to ignore, but her personal life had to be cleaned up. Made out to be harmless, they said she had a daughter named Cleis. Two surviving bits of writing mention this kid, but there's still doubt. The word pays can mean daughter, but in other settings it might mean a young lover. Some academics reckon Cleis was Sappho's daughter, while others reckon the bond was more complex, not something you can easily put in today's words. What we do know for sure is that Sappho hung around with a bunch of younger women. The Greeks called these sorts of groups theasoi, which were pretty common across Greece, especially in Sparta, and they were set up for religious and teaching purposes. Before they got married, girls would join these groups to learn music, poetry, and dance the arts of being charming and attractive. These groups worshipped specific gods and built up strong emotional bonds between members. On Lesbos, Sappho was in charge of one of these thiasoi. Sappho wasn't the only one. Two other Sheilas, Gorgon and Andromeda, ran their own competing groups. We only know their names because Sappho's surviving bits and pieces sometimes mention them, usually not in a good way. The rivalry between these communities was real for over a century. A particular way of thinking dominated what academics thought about Sappho's Thiasos. In the late 1800s, German classicist Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Moellendorff suggested that Sappho was running a girls' school. According to this view, she was like a headmistress, and her poems reflected the teacher-student bond. This interpretation conveniently ignored the strong sexual bits in her writing, just teacher and student, nothing more. This theory stuck around because it was convenient. It made Sappho look respectable, but, as later scholars pointed out, there wasn't a scrap of evidence to back it up. Not one of Sappho's poems even mentions running a school. The Thiasos wasn't a formal school. It was a spiritual and social bunch focused on ritual celebrations and, yeah, desire as the poetry really shows. Strong same-sex attraction between women, not hinted at or symbolic, but an open expression of both physical and emotional longing. This isn't some modern interpretation shoved onto old texts. Back in the day, audiences also saw it that way. By around the late 500s BCE, the word lesbian had already shifted its meaning. Instead of just meaning someone from Lesbos, it started referring to a woman who's into other women. This change happened while Sappho's legacy was still fresh. In her famous poem Fragment 31, she talks about watching a loved one chatting with a bloke. Her body reacts big time. Tongue goes numb, fire runs under her skin, and she can't see or hear properly. Sweat's pouring off her, she's shaking like crazy, her skin's paler than grass, and she feels closer to death than alive. This ain't just fancy words. It's a body at its breaking point, totally wrecked by jealousy and desire. In the only full poem we've got, addressed to Aphrodite, Sappho chats straight to the goddess. She asks for help to win over a woman who doesn't love her back. The goddess reminds her that she's helped before. The woman who's running away now will end up chasing. The one knocking back presents will start giving them. The one who doesn't love will soon love, even if she doesn't want to. This poem hints at endless cycles of wanting and chasing, something anyone who's had unrequited love would get. Some modern scholars have tried to argue against this reading. These academics reckon it's dodgy to call Sappho a lesbian because she wouldn't have understood the term that way. They point out that ancient Greek sexuality doesn't match up with modern labels. Glenn Most said Sappho wouldn't have a clue what we mean by calling her homosexual. André Lardinois thought the whole question was ridiculous. Parge Dubois called it a particularly confusing debate, but these scholars are right about how different understandings of sexuality were back then. The ancient Greeks didn't see sexual orientation as an identity, but trying to make Sappho's attraction to women look vague or doubtful, or rejecting the lesbian tag, often feels like another form of erasure. Her poetry celebrates erotic love between women. Sandra Boehringer puts it bluntly. Sappho's work clearly celebrates erotic love between women. That plain fact shouldn't get lost in theoretical mumbo-jumbo. But the Theosoi weren't just about passion, they were religious groups. Women there worshipped, did rituals, and celebrated festivals together. Aphrodite pops up a lot in Sappho's remaining works, along with the Graces and Muses. The sacred and the erotic weren't split apart, like later Christianity would separate them. Heavenly beauty and human beauty reflected each other. Worshipping Aphrodite meant honoring desire, pleasure, and the body's capacity for joy. In these groups, young women learned singing, dancing, writing poetry, and getting through life with confidence and style. They formed bonds that lasted beyond their Thyasos days, beyond marriage, and beyond the usual expectations ahead. Sappho's poems often address women who've left, married, and moved away. They carry longing, but also memory, a sense of shared experience that distance can't destroy. Fragment 16 starts with different people, claiming different things, are the most beautiful. Some say cavalry, some say foot soldiers, some say ships, but the speaker reckons the most beautiful thing is whatever you love. Then she brings up Helen of Troy, the one whose beauty launched 1,000 ships, who left her husband and kid to follow her passion. The poem connects personal desire with myth, suggesting that chasing what you want, even if it breaks the rules, has its own worth. This was revolutionary, both in content and style. Sappho wrote in first person, bearing her own feelings, her body, and her personal experiences. She didn't try to cover up her thoughts with fancy stories or wishy-washy talk. Instead, she came right out and said, I want, I remember, I feel stuff. That straight-up honesty, refusing to make emotions sound all distant and universal, was a real game-changer. She mixed bits of the Aeolic dialect with Homer's big epic words, and her sentences were short, blunt, and really vivid. She could step back and look at her own feelings from a distance and dissect them like a pro, but the raw heat of those emotions never faded. This idea of remembering emotions when things are calm came centuries before Wordsworth's famous line. She invented a verse structure that still called after her the Sapphic stanza, 3 lines with 11 beats each, then a shorter 5-beat line. That rhythm pattern got copied by poets for 2,000 years. Catullus used it in Latin. Horace did his own take. And English writers from the Renaissance onward had a crack at it too. The stanza itself carried on her legacy, way beyond just the bits of her writing that survive. When she was alive, Sappho was properly famous, not just well-respected. Big cities put her face on coins and built statues in her honor. Legend has it that after hearing a young bloke sing one of her songs, the Athenian lawmaker Solon asked to learn it straight off, so he could nail it and then kick the bucket. Plato called her the 10th muse. So she joined the 9 muses as a source of inspiration for art. For centuries after she died, people called her the poetess, just like Homer was the poet. But being famous doesn't mean your work sticks around forever. What happened next would decide whether those 10,000 verses would last for future generations or just vanish into the dirt of the Mediterranean. The library at Alexandria totally changed the game. Around 280 BCE, 300 years after Sappho passed away, a bunch of Egyptian scholars started a project that would determine which writer's work survived and which got lost. They set about sorting out Greek literature, making official editions, and deciding what the literary canon should be, and Sappho made the cut. Those academics divided her work into 8 or 9 volumes. We can't be dead certain which number's right, because the ancient sources don't agree with each other. The volumes were sorted by meter, with each book collecting poems that used the same beat. The first 3 books each focused on one particular rhythm. This way of organizing things shows how they saw her work. Mainly as a technical achievement, a mastery of poetic form worth keeping and studying. The Alexandrian edition became the official version. They made duplicate copies and sent them out to libraries all around the Mediterranean. Rome got them. Athens had them anywhere Greek influence reached. Sappho's poems went along with it for the next 700 years. Her whole collection was around and available to anyone who could read Greek and get into a library. But being easy to find doesn't mean it'll be kept safe. The Alexandrian edition was written on papyrus scrolls. Papyrus doesn't last forever. It tears, draws in bugs that eat it, falls apart in damp places, and catches fire real easy, so each generation had to make new copies. Otherwise, the writing would be gone. And for 700 years, people kept making those copies. They did it not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The poems mattered that much, so it was worth the effort. The Romans were totally taken with Sappho. Catullus, writing in the 1st century BCE, used the Sapphic stanza in his own poems. He called his lover Lesbia in his work, an obvious nod to Sappho's island home. He translated Fragment 31, her poem about jealousy and desire, into Latin. His own poem, 51, is basically Sappho's Fragment 31, reworked for a Roman setting, using Latin instead of Greek, but keeping the core feeling intact. Later, Roman poets did the same. Horace had a go at the Sapphic meter, and Ovid dropped references to her. Even writers who didn't directly copy her knew she was important. She was the gold standard for judging female poets, proving gals could totally nail literary brilliance. That was huge in a society that often put down women's smarts. But the Romans weren't exactly chuffed about it. Horace called her mascula Sappho, like blokey Sappho. Later boffins argued if that was a pat on the back for killing it in a male-dominated field or a dig at her sexuality, probably a bit of both. The Romans thought the gay vibes in her poems were dead interesting, but also a bit confronting. They couldn't ignore them, because they were core to her work, but they also couldn't fully get on board with them. Even as late as the 3rd century AD, 900 years after she kicked the bucket, towns were still minting coins with her face on them. Mytilene, the capital of Lesbos, proudly called her their most famous local. The coin had her picture and a lyre with her name, marking her as a poet. That wasn't just a nod to a historical figure. It was a big call about cultural clout, saying Lesbos spawned someone huge across the Greek world. When Christianity rocked up, everything changed. The new faith didn't trust pagan writings at all. Some works got a pass cause of their philosophical wisdom or historical worth. Homer hung around cause his stuff was key to understanding classic civilization. Plato survived because his ideas could be twisted to fit Christian teachings, but lyric poetry that sang about women loving women was way harder to justify. People started having a crack at it real early. Tatian, a Christian writer from the 2nd century, called Sappho a prostitute whose songs glorified her own dodgy behavior. That wasn't a literary review, it was a moral condemnation. The poems themselves were seen as evidence of depravity, something to stamp out rather than protect. Other Christian bigwigs agreed. St. Gregory of Nazianzus bagged her poetry. Roughly 1,000 years after Tatian, Pope Gregory VII supposedly ordered her works to be torched. Boffins reckon there's doubt that order was ever actually given, but the story stuck around, because it sounded believable. Course the church would want to get rid of poetry that hyped up women's desire, which put women's views front and center instead of on the sidelines. But the real danger wasn't fire. Nah, it was neglect. Around the 7th century, something shifted. Sappho's poems had outlived heaps of other famous Greek lyric poets, even as their work vanished. Her stuff kept getting copied, but by the 7th century even that stopped. The move from papyrus rolls to parchment books made things harder. The new format was more durable, but it meant people had to choose which texts to copy down. You couldn't just shift everything across, had to pick and choose. Slowly, folks decided not to copy Sappho anymore, not because they hated her writing, but because it wasn't useful anymore. It didn't teach Christian morals or give any practical know-how. Her poetry was a beaut to read, but beauty on its own wasn't enough. In the 9th century, Byzantine scribes started using a new handwriting style, minuscule script. This script took up less space and was more streamlined than the old uncial letters. It meant they had to recopy everything into the new format, which was another chance for works to get lost. And that's exactly what happened to Sappho. There's no evidence her works ever got copied out in minuscule script. The last time anyone could get hold of her complete poetry was round about the 8th or 9th century. After that, every bit of it disappeared. Well, not exactly nothing. Some quotes hung around. Old-school lit critics had saved them. They chucked Sappho's lines into their own stuff to show off meter, language, or style. Then those bits got copied along with the critical works that had them. So, a Byzantine library might have had a book on Greek meter, and tucked away inside 4 lines from Sappho, used as an example of the Sapphic stanza. Sometimes an old writer'd quote a whole poem. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing his thing on literary composition in the 1st century BC, shoved in the full Ode to Aphrodite to show off Sappho's skills. His book lasted even though her poetry didn't. So that one complete poem survived not because anyone really wanted to keep Sappho, but because scholars wanted to hang on to Dionysius's critique. For over 1,000 years, only these random quotes were around. Medieval and Renaissance scholars knew she existed. They knew she was once considered a legend. They had fragments, tantalizing hints, but the bulk of her writing was gone. Vanishing sometime between the 9th century and the Renaissance, these works copped it because of changes in writing tech, plus shifting tastes and religious views. The fragments that survived shaped how people saw her later. Without her full collection, folks filled in the gaps with imagination and prejudice. Medieval writers knew her as a famous woman poet from Lesbos. They knew she wrote about love. With just a few fragments mentioning women, They spun yarns around that. A long-running legend had it that she loved a ferryman named Phaon, who knocked her back, so she jumped off the Leucadian cliffs. There's no sign of that story in her surviving poems. This story probably came from Greek comedy, where writers made up silly scenarios about real people for laughs. But without her real writings to prove otherwise, the myth stuck around and served a purpose. It made her relatable to audiences who were uncomfortable with the idea of a woman being into women. She got turned into a tragic romantic icon, dying because of unrequited straight love, slotting nicely into classic tales. The real Sappho, who wrote about craving women with incredible honesty, was hidden behind this made-up character. Renaissance intellectuals knew or should have known better. They had old critiques that described her work more accurately, but the Phaon story was dramatic and sad, easy to paint. Art showed her leaping off cliffs, staring at the distant boat carrying her lover. It was ridiculous, but it was a captivating kind of ridiculous. Meanwhile, the real manuscripts were rotting in Egyptian rubbish dumps literally. Ancient Egyptians used papyrus for everything, and when documents went out of date, they tossed them out over the centuries. These dump sites built up layers of papyrus rubbish, and the dry weather preserved them in a way that couldn't happen anywhere else. In wet places, organic stuff rots, but Egypt's desert conditions actually keep them safe. They dry out and last, but nobody knew this treasure was there. The piles were just old rubbish mounds in the desert, sometimes raided by locals looking for fertilizer. Any papyri inside, if anyone even noticed, looked like useless scraps. Who'd want documents written in dead languages, all torn, faded, and incomplete? It wasn't till the late 1800s that archaeologists started paying attention. Digs around Oxyrhynchus, an old Greek-Egyptian town, started turning up heaps of papyri. Most of it was just everyday stuff. Tax forms, personal letters, shopping lists, legal papers, the boring admin of ancient life. But buried in all that government junk were literary treasures. Bits of Homer, lost plays by Greek writers, and, unbelievably, pieces of Sappho. The first discoveries came in 1897 when two British blokes, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, started digging through rubbish heaps at Oxyrhynchus. They weren't specifically after Sappho, they were just looking for whatever they could find. But when they started sorting their finds, they came across her stuff, lines in ancient Greek. The verses stuck to the poetic meters described in classical theory. The writing dated those manuscripts to the 2nd or 3rd century AD, over 800 years after Sappho kicked the bucket. Still, they were old enough that they might hold accurate copies. Those fragments were in a shocking condition, torn, faded, with barely a few words per line still legible. The papyrus had been reused, scribbled on, turned into cartonnage for mummy casings or padding for coffins. One academic went blind from the sheer effort of transcribing these pieces, and another had a nervous breakdown for a bit. The job involved deciphering faded ink on wrecked papyrus, often with keywords missing, and reconstructing the meaning from context and a deep knowledge of Greek poetic rhythm. But these were genuinely Sappho's works, after 1,000 years, when only bits and pieces lived on in other authors' books. Now, new fragments appeared, not exactly full poems most of the time, but still decent chunks. These bits were enough to give us an idea of her range, the topics she kept coming back to, and the emotional landscape of her poems. More stuff turned up later on. In 1914, researchers dug up coffins in Marseille, made from leftover papyrus. Ancient Egyptian undertakers used whatever paper they could grab, including Greek writings. After carefully peeling back the layers of the coffins, scholars found more pieces of Sappho. The dead were buried, wrapped up in her poetry, their bodies preserved by texts written 1,000 years before they themselves died. Discoveries kept flooding in all through the 20th century, each new one causing a buzz. For scholars of ancient texts, these additions went from a few extra lines to a completely unknown poem, sometimes just single words. But even those little bits mattered, because they either backed up or challenged existing theories about her vocabulary and style. These fragments were like puzzles. They gave us tantalizing glimpses of a bigger body of work that mostly stayed hidden. The stuff that came out of these bits matched what ancient critics described, but it turned out to be way more lively. Her language felt immediate and physical. Fragment 31, a pretty well-preserved piece, is raw with emotion. It describes watching someone else talking and laughing with the woman they love. The physical signs of jealousy and desire are described in fine detail. A tongue broken, fire running under the skin, eyesight failin', ears ringin', sweat pouring down, shakin', goin' paler than grass. That kind of intimate physical description, a shameless, unguarded look at how desire hits the body, was a game changer, and it's still one. When it was dug up 2,000 years later, that poem influenced modern poetry just as much as it influenced ancient poetry. This showed how powerful language can be when it's aimed at physical experience rather than abstract ideas. Fragment 16 became one of the most analyzed pieces. The poem starts with different people claiming different things are the best: cavalry, infantry, ships. But the speaker reckons the most beautiful thing is just whatever you fancy. Then Helen of Troy comes in, the woman who gave up everything for love. The poem doesn't judge her. She's shown as proof that chastened desire, even when it goes against what society reckons is normal, has its own logic and legitimacy. These bits and pieces revealed a poet who thought deeply about desire. When it comes to beauty, and the bond between two people who knew that attraction ain't logical, can't be organized or controlled, but it's still genuine and strong enough to change lives. The myth was fallen apart, replaced by something more fascinating. A clever mind dealing with experiences that still ring true thousands of years later. But the leftovers also showed just how much was lost. Every new bit of Sappho found made the missing bits hurt even more. We got quick glimpses. We sensed that something amazing was here, but we couldn't get the whole picture. The complete poems, the books set out by meter, the 10,000 lines that ancient folks knew, all gone. What survived were scraps pulled from rubbish dumps and coffin linings, saved by accident, not on purpose. The 21st century gave us two discoveries that changed everything, not just for Sappho studies, but for how we get the connection between history and today, between what's lost and what's found again. In 2004, researchers announced what they called the Tuthenis poem, which wasn't completely new. A few lines had been known before, quoted in an old classic. But now there were extra verses, enough to see the whole train of thought. The poem faces getting old with a bluntness that's still pretty amazing. It mentions Tithonus, the mythical bloke who got eternal life, but not eternal youth, stuck getting older forever. The speaker's own again body becomes the main focus. Gray hair, knees that can't dance anymore. Skin that used to be soft. These aren't just thoughts. They're notes from someone watching their own body change, feeling the difference between then and now. This discovery got huge global media coverage, and top newspapers ran stories. The BBC even covered it. It was more than just an academic curiosity. The poem connected with people because it dealt with a universal thing. Getting older, seeing yourself turn into someone you don't recognize. It doesn't offer any comfort or advice about again. It just states the truth. How weird it is to live in a body that keeps changing without your say. So, what made the Tithonus poem so important was Sappho thinking about death from a personal angle, not a mythic one. Old-time poetry often used myths as frameworks for human life. This poem does the same, referring to Tithonus, but then shifts to the now, the real, the speaker's own experience. The story turns into a way to think about something happening right here, right now, inside this body at this moment. 10 years later, an even more shocking find popped up. In 2014, scholars announced they'd found what's now known as the Brothers poem. This piece was completely new. No ancient source had ever mentioned it, and no scrap had survived from earlier digs. It came from a privately owned collection of papyrus that was later sold at auction, then checked by experts who realized how important it was. The poem mentions Charaxos and Lyrikos, names that old sources had listed as Sappho's brothers and sisters. But those names had never appeared in the work of hers that survived before this discovery. Scholars had argued over whether Sappho actually wrote about her family. Maybe those ancient biographical details were made up. Stories made up to explain poems that were actually fiction, and the Brothers poem showed she really did write about her family. Those names were genuine references, not later fakes, but the content was what really counted. The speaker talks to someone, probably another family member, who keeps saying that Charaxos will come back on his boat, loaded with stuff. The speaker pushes back against that sureness. How can you be sure of what the gods might do? People's knowledge is limited. The future ain't ours to guess. Then the poem changes to a prayer, wishing that Lyrikos grows up, becomes a man, and helps the family get through their problems. This here's a poem about family life and stuff going on at home. One of the brothers is off on a trading trip that could go either way. The other brother's still young, not quite the bloke he's got to become. The speaker's all torn between hope and fear, between what she wants to reckon and what she knows she can't control. This weren't the Sappho from the big myths or fiery passion. This was a woman dealing with ordinary family worries, the sort that hasn't changed in centuries. Since families still work the same way, we still stress about our siblings. We still hope the younger ones in the family will grow into their full potential. We still can't control the outcomes, no matter how much we might want to. And the whole discovery process had its fair share of arguments. Those papyrus bits were owned privately. They got sold to collectors instead of heading straight to universities or museums. Some researchers wondered if buying this stuff just encourages more looting of ancient sites. Others reckon that private collectors actually saved these bits when they could have been lost for good. It's all about the ethics of the antiquities trade, who really owns old writings, and the clash between letting academics have a look and keeping things private. All that became part of the story. But the poem was legit. Heaps of scholars confirmed it's the real deal. The handwriting matched other papyri from that time. The dialect was spot on, and the meter was proper Sapphic. The content lined up with what old sources said about her family. This was genuine Sappho, brought back from silence after 2,500 years. What both finds showed is just how much we still don't know. Each new bit of papyrus tweaks the picture a bit. The Tithonus poem chucked aging onto the list of topics Sappho wrote about. The brother poem added family stress, home worries, and the everyday anxieties that filled her mind. When she wasn't writing about desire or beauty or the gods, ancient critics didn't really highlight those. When they gave her a pat on the back, they went on about her love poems, her emotional depth, and how well she could put physical desire into words. The new discoveries suggested her range was bigger than what the existing bits had shown. They also made it clear how random survival is. These poems lasted because someone in ancient Egypt used papyrus for rubbish, building stuff, or whatever, and left it buried somewhere dry enough to keep it safe. Other poems, just as good, or maybe even better, got lost because the papyrus they were on ended up in a damp spot. It rotted, got burnt, recycled, or otherwise destroyed. Keeping old texts alive ain't about how good they are. It's about luck, location, and weather. Pure random chance, and when scholars had a look at the new bits, they spotted something else. The papyrus itself could be dated, analyzed, and seen as a historical artifact separate from the writing on it. The Cologne papyrus, which has the Tithonus poem, goes back to the 3rd century BC, making it the oldest piece of Sappho we've got. Someone copied this poem 700 years before the whole manuscript thing that saved most classical texts. Someone reckoned it was worth copying, keeping, and passing along. Then it got lost, then buried. Then it survived in conditions that wrecked heaps of other texts. Then it got discovered. The whole process of looking at these bits was super careful. The papyrus is in real rough shape. It's fragile, discolored. Parts of letters are missing. Words aren't finished. Sometimes you can make out single letters but not whole words. Other times, you can have a guess from context, but you can't be sure. The experts working on these texts need a deep understanding of ancient Greek to spot patterns. They've got to act like detectives, filling in the gaps using clues from meter, grammar, and dialect. Working with partial evidence, they come up with ideas about what probably went in the gaps, but scholars don't all agree on these fragments. Different experts have different takes on the damaged bits. There's a lot of debate about how to restore certain words. Same goes for whether some passages are meant literally or figuratively, and whether certain pronouns refer to people, gods, or abstract ideas. These fragments don't give us definite answers. They offer possible meanings and a bunch of valid interpretations, plus discussions that might never be settled. What is sure is that every discovery, no matter how small, matters. Just one extra word can back up or completely change what we think about Sappho's vocabulary. A new line can reveal things about her rhythm, her imagery, and what themes she liked. These fragments are bits of a puzzle that'll never be complete, but each piece changes how we see the missing bits. Or maybe it's the gap itself, or what that gap would have looked like if it was still whole. The discoveries from 2004 and 2014 also changed how the average person talks about Sappho. Media stories introduced her to people who'd never normally come across academic stuff. Folks who didn't know her name learned that writings by an ancient Greek poet are still being dug up. They're still read and thought important enough to make world headlines. These discoveries became cultural events, not just academic milestones. They also sparked chats about what we've lost. If fragments keep turning up after 2,000 years, what else could still be out there? What papyrus rolls are sitting in private collections, never looked at? Which old rubbish dumps haven't been excavated yet? Which libraries or monasteries might have manuscripts that haven't been properly catalogued? These discoveries brought new possibilities, even as they highlighted what's gone. Because here's what we know. 10,000 lines have been cut down to 650, 9 volumes down to just bits. A whole collection that ancient readers studied, memorized, quoted, and argued over, now almost completely gone. What's left is enough to show how much we've lost. Every fragment reminds us of what's missing. The poems called Tithonus and Brother didn't just add to Sappho's surviving stuff. They changed how scholars see the connection between the existing bits and the lost whole, especially since these poems turned up after being completely forgotten. What other complete poems might still be hidden somewhere, waiting to be found? What could future discoveries reveal? The answer is we don't know, and that's the point. The archive is still open. New bits could turn up as early as tomorrow, or maybe never. With preservation being so unpredictable, anything's possible. What we know now isn't set in stone. It's dependent, temporary, and can change based on future digs. That unpredictability is what defines the whole field. Dealing with bits and pieces of classics means working with what you've got, even though it's not complete. You build your arguments knowing that new info could knock them down. When you're reading old texts, you realize a heap of context is missing. You've got to accept that solid answers aren't possible, uncertainty sticks around, and there'll always be more questions than answers. Even though our bits and bobs are incomplete, banged up, and chucked together by chance, they still do the job. They keep passing on meaning right through the ages. They show a brain mulling over desire, beauty, getting older, family, and the gods. All the stuff that got people going back then and still does today. The fact that it's all broken up is proper frustrating. But what's left shows why Sappho mattered, why she's still important, and why her words still ring true through these leftovers. Those fragments have also changed how we think about sex back in ancient Greece. Before the big discoveries, scholars had bugger all evidence about desire in Sappho's time. Fragment 31, which goes into the physical feelings of attraction, was really powerful but stood on its own. The extra fragments gave context, showed patterns, and revealed a wider range of how emotions were expressed. Instead of settling the arguments about Sappho's sexuality, they made the chats more complex, and that's a much better result. Wondering, was Sappho gay? Assumes that today's labels work for old-time realities. The Greeks didn't think about sexual orientation the way we do. Their idea of who you were all came down to what you desired, what you did, and your place in society. The word lesbian comes from Lesbos, Sappho's island. But over the centuries, its meanings changed in ways she could never have imagined. She lived in a society that had its own ways of understanding attraction between women. Her poems show deep feelings for women. That bit's not up for debate, no matter if those feelings turned into action, were returned, or were just emotional without being physical. Those questions aren't as important as what the poetry actually does. It creates a whole new way of talking about longing, making certain experiences visible, sayable, and worthy of being turned into art. What's left shows someone thinking about beauty, wanting, and how desire hits the body. Fragment 31 is famous partly because it's so incredibly specific. Someone watching a person they like chatting and laughing with someone else gets a massive flood of physical stuff. Tongue stops working, heat rushes under the skin, vision goes blurry, ears ring, sweat pours out, shaking takes over, and the speaker goes paler than grass. Feeling like they're about to die, this is anything but vague. It's a body responding to desire with total force. Other fragments are gentler, but just as direct. Fragment 96 shows someone moving among Lydian women like the moon outshining the stars. Fragment 16 says the most beautiful thing isn't horses, soldiers, or boats, it's the person you love. These aren't just ideas, they're statements about how desire rules everything and how love changes your view, picking out one special person. The brothers' poem added another level, maybe even more valuable than the rest. It showed Sappho's family worries, her brother Charaxos coming home safe from a trading trip, and her other brother Larikos growing up. Her personal writing goes beyond just desire. It also covers everyday family stress, practical problems, and hoping for good outcomes when things are out of your hands. This is important because it stops us from narrowing Sappho down to just one subject. She sure wrote about longing, but she also knocked out poems about family, gods, flowers, nighttime, and music. What's left of her work leans towards certain topics because later writers only quoted what grabbed them. Old-school grammarians kept lines that showed off unusual dialect features. Christian writers who quoted her sometimes had a go at her morals. Meanwhile, lovely romantic bits were copied just because they looked nice. But the full collection, 10,000 lines all up, probably had heaps of variety. Hymns for worship, wedding songs, and poems for civic gigs. It also threw in personal thoughts, nature observations, and political commentary. The bits we have left are just samples, not a fair pick. They show what they call survival bias. What survived was down to chance. Bits quoted by others, papyrus that ended up in Egypt, and scraps used as mummy wrappings. So reading Sappho means you're dealing with both intentional art and accidental preservation. Sappho meant to write these verses, but she never planned for them to survive in such a broken state, chopped up, unfinished, sometimes just single words. Their survival was pure luck, shaped by things she couldn't control: dry desert conditions, burial practices, academic interests, and religious suppression. None of it her doing. Even though they're damaged, you can still pick out her unique voice, even in just a few words. You can see her trademarks: straightforwardness, precision, and passionate depth. She doesn't get melodramatic, never overdoes it or explains too much. She relies on images, concrete details, and gestures to show meaning. Fragment 105 has just 2 Greek words. Like the sweet apple, reddening on the branch top. On the very highest branch. The apple pickers missed it, actually. They didn't forget. They just couldn't reach it. So, there you go. A ripe apple on the top branch, out of reach. The fragment ends, but the meaning's clear. Something you want but can't get. A perfect thing left alone because it's too far or too hard. The image says it all. No need for explanation. The apple shines against the leaves, way up high. Straight away, you get it, longing for what's out of reach. The fragment's incompleteness seems to actually make it more powerful. The idea fades away, leaving just the picture and the implied yearning. Fragment 168b is even shorter. The moon and the Pleiades have set. It's midnight. Time goes by. I lie here by myself, 5 or 6 lines, based on reconstruction, but the loneliness is total. The celestial references show time passing. The speaker is lying awake, alone, really aware of time moving while she stays on her own. Its brevity makes it hit harder. These tiny remains show a key part of Sappho's approach. She works through concrete images, specific details, and precise observations. She stays away from abstract stuff and generalizations. Instead, she shows you the setting moon, the unattainable apple, and the physical signs of desire, trusting you'll get what they mean. This technique shaped poetry for 2,000 years, focusing on images, showing instead of telling, and relying on readers to make the connections. It became a foundation of lyric verse. Sappho didn't invent it, but she nailed it so well that later poets studied and copied her work. The Sapphic stanza, the meter she used, also lived on. It's got 3 lines of 11 syllables each, then a line with just 5. The rhythm's unique, slightly uneven, ending in a way that feels complete. Poets in ancient Greece and Rome used it. Medieval poets adapted it. Renaissance authors brought it back, and modern poets still play with it. This meter carries meaning. Today, writing in Sapphic stanzas deliberately connects your poetry to Sappho's. This poetic form is now tied forever to her identity, her themes, and the surviving fragments. It stands as a ghost of her full work, a structure that outlasted the poems themselves. It originally gave structure, but her influence goes way beyond technical bits. Sappho changed what poetry could actually be about. Back before Sappho's time, Greek poetry was all about epic stuff: heroes, battles, gods, and public matters. But she turned poetry inwards, got it focused on personal feelings, close-up experiences, and private moments, making the subjective side of things something worth putting into art. That might seem pretty obvious these days, seeing as modern poetry mostly deals with personal thoughts, individual experiences, and emotional reactions. But someone had to show that this space was worth exploring. that private feelings could lead to art just as powerful as public yarns. Sappho pulled that off by showing how personal stuff connects to bigger patterns. She made the individual universal. Her takes on desire and physical feelings are solidly rooted in her own time, situation, and body. At the same time, she nails something anyone who's felt strong desire can recognize. What's specific becomes universal. The individual becomes a symbol. That's the heart of lyric poetry, and Sappho was one of the first to really tap into its full potential. Plus, the bits we've got left show off her brilliant technique. Her language is spot on, tight, and musical. The Aeolic Greek she used has unique sound qualities softer than Attic, more vowels, with its own rhythms. Hearing Sappho in her original Greek, even just the broken bits, reveals how carefully she built those sound patterns. No English translation can fully capture those qualities. The music gets lost in translation, the exact sounds, the word echoes, the subtle rhythmic details. What does stick around is the structure, imagery, and emotional depth. But the sound side, the whole reason these poems were sung with a lyre, is mostly out of reach for readers who don't know Greek. That's a real challenge. Most people come across Sappho through translations, interpretations, and reconstructions, trying to pass on something that originally lived as sound and rhythm in a dead language. These translations are valuable, essential, and often beautiful, but they're not Sappho. They're responses to her, versions of her fragments. The gap's huge. Complete poems in Aeolic Greek, once sung with music for specific audiences, have been whittled down to fragments that get reconstructed, translated, printed, and read in silence. Each step takes us further from that first experience, but something still survives the journey. Even through all these changes, the core stays recognizable. That kind of staying power says something pretty fundamental about the poetry. It's not just beautiful sounds in one language. It's got ideas, images, and emotions that cross time and language barriers. That apple on the highest branch speaks in every language. The physical signs of desire are understood everywhere, and the loneliness of lying awake on your own goes beyond any specific period. So Sappho sticks around not despite the bits and pieces, but because of them. The fragmentary state forces readers to get involved, to fill in the gaps, to imagine what's missing. Complete poems could be admired, studied, and appreciated. Fragments demand engagement, turning readers into collaborators, co-creators, and partners in building meaning. Every reconstruction is an act of interpretation, every translation an act of creation. Every time you meet Sappho, you're building something from leftovers, piecing together wholeness from fragments, and finding order in the leftovers. This active participation keeps her writing alive in a way that perfect preservation never could. Strangely enough, the fragments create a kind of democracy because of what's missing. Readers from different backgrounds, times, and perspectives can find their own meanings. Those gaps allow for multiple interpretations, many readings, and ongoing conversation. If all the work had survived, it might have been more fixed, more static, less open to new takes. Fragments resist being finished. They don't settle into one meaning but stay open, suggestive, and rich for endless discussion and debate. That openness is partly by accident from stuff decaying over time, but it's also become the work's trademark. Sappho means fragments. Fragments mean possibility, diversity, and ongoing exploration. And new discoveries keep turning up. The 2014 finds weren't the last. Back in 2018, they uncovered more lines from the brothers' poem on some papyrus bits in a private collection. By 2021, researchers used fancy new imaging methods to spot writing that was hidden on papyri already in well-known collections. This archive keeps throwing up surprise findings, each one tweaking the academic landscape a bit. A new word can back up a theory or knock it down, and a fresh line might clear up a reference or make things even more complicated. Those fragments are naturally shaky, always being re-looked at, reinterpreted, and stuck into new settings. Our grip on Sappho is still pretty uncertain, always ready to shift, depending on whatever pops up in future. That sort of uncertainty is pretty typical for classical studies overall, but it really stands out with Sappho. The amount of lost stuff compared to what's left is mind-boggling. The fragments are dead fascinating, and everyone's desperate for more. Every new discovery is a ripper gift, but it also reminds you just how much we've lost. With each fragment dug up, there's the hope the next one will be even bigger and more revealing. That hope is fair enough, but it's probably a bit unrealistic. The big finds have most likely already happened. Oxyrhynchus has been dug over properly, and most major papyrus collections have been digitized and gone through with a fine-tooth comb. Even though advanced imaging might reveal unreadable text on existing bits, the chances of finding major new poems are pretty slim. Egypt's old rubbish tips have been well and truly sifted. What's left is private collections, fragments with no known history, and stuff that might turn up through the antiquities trade. Stuff does pop up every now and then, but you can't realistically expect another whole poem or a big chunk of a lost book. What we've got now is probably all we're ever gonna get. This situation raises some uncomfortable questions about interpretations built on what's missing, especially when scholars talk about Sappho's life. Her relationships, her beliefs, they're cobbled together from bits that make up maybe just 6% of her total work. Coming up with fancy theories from such meager evidence is pretty dodgy. It's like trying to rebuild a building from a few scattered bricks. What you end up with reflects your own assumptions as much as the original structure. Take the question of her sexuality. The surviving fragments clearly express desire aimed at women. Fragment 31, which describes physical reactions while watching a woman talk and laugh, is obviously about female beauty. Fragment 16 reckons Helen was right to give up everything for love, because desire is impossible to resist. These lines are hardly subtle. The homoerotic stuff is dead obvious. But how much can we really figure out about Sappho's own life from verses that might be made up, performed, or just following conventions of a genre we don't really get? There's a big urge to read the fragments as autobiography, assuming Sappho is telling her own story. But lyric poetry doesn't work like that, at least not always, or necessarily. A poet can take on different voices, make up situations, and work within traditions that have nothing to do with real life. When a bloke poet writes love poems to a woman, we don't automatically assume they're true stories. So why do we treat Sappho differently? Partly because we want to. The bits that survive feel personal, intimate, and right there like a window straight into her soul. And since there's bugger all other sources about ancient women's feelings and sex lives, Sappho becomes a stand-in, a symbol, something crucial. She's one of the rare female voices that made it through from ancient times. The pressure to give her meaning, to squeeze every last bit of significance from super-limited clues, is huge. The Thiassos idea came about partly because of that pressure. If Sappho wrote poems about young women, the logic goes, she must have been their teacher. If she expressed desire for them, it had to be part of educational initiation rituals, a socially okay homoeroticism within a teaching setup. This reading makes her sexuality acceptable, understandable, and kept within proper social limits. This view gets rid of the uncomfortable idea that she was just a woman writing about wanting other women with no institutional backdrop at all. But the evidence for the Thiassos theory is pretty thin. It ain't mentioned in any of Sappho's bits that survive. Even the old sources don't talk about it. This whole idea is built on comparing stuff from Sparta and guesses about how posh girls got schooled. Might be spot on, or it could just be academics pushing their own need to slot Sappho into neat little boxes. We're still in the dark. The bits we've got don't give any answers. What they do show is that someone wrote some seriously gorgeous poetry about wanting, losing, beauty, memories, and the gods. Those poems got kept because folks thought they were top-notch. They've been through partial wreckage, cultural changes, religious censorship, language shifts, and tech advances. The key thing is its trip from spoken word to written form, then to print, and finally to digital. The life story stuff, while interesting, is not as important as the poetry itself. Even as broken bits, in translation, and without the music and performance setting, the work still packs a punch. Fragment 31 still nails the physical feeling of desire, and Fragment 16 still shows the battle between love and duty. The apple fragment still hints at something beautiful but always out of reach. These images ring true across ages and cultures because they're rooted in stuff that never changes about being human. Our bodies still react to wanting in the same way. People still put love first over duty, and beautiful things stay out of reach. Sappho's influence on later poetry is huge, but tricky to pin down. Roman poets like Catullus and Horace used her rhythms and themes, and they straight-up name-dropped her. Both of them copied her style, and Catullus even did a Latin version of Fragment 31. But they had the whole poems, which we don't. so their take on Sappho was way more complete and in context than what we've got. When medieval and Renaissance poets rediscovered her, they found something pretty similar to what we've got now. Even after the poems were gone, bits and pieces of the Sapphic stanza stuck around as a formal thing. Poets used the meter without always getting the meaning. The form got separated from its origin, becoming a technical drill and a way to show off classical know-how. Some poets, especially women, called Sappho a predecessor. She was proof that women could write serious poetry, but they often had to stick up for her against accusations of immorality. Over time, Sappho's rep swung between loving her art and being uneasy about her sexuality. The Victorian era really struggled with this. They worshipped Greek culture but expected it to be morally pure. Sappho was a real problem. Her bits were too obvious to ignore, too beautiful to dismiss, and too important for classical studies to drop. The fix was to reimagine her desire as something else entirely. They called it academic affection, teacherly warmth, or just standard poetic stuff, anything except real sexual desire for women. That took some creative reading, pick and choose translating, and willful misinterpretation. Fragment 31 got recast as admiring virtue. The physical reactions were brushed off as just aesthetic appreciation. The setting was called educational. The gymnastics were just impressive. By the 20th century, that line couldn't hold. The bits were too clear, and the proof too strong. Sappho wrote about wanting women. You either cop that, or bin the poems. Most scholars have accepted it, but arguments still go on about the right terms and historical context. The chat shifted from whether Sappho was homosexual to whether using modern tags like lesbian or homosexual even fits an ancient Greek poet. She lived in a whole different way of thinking about sexuality. This talk shows something important about how we deal with history. Sappho matters to today's chats about sexuality because she gives us a historical example proof that same-sex desire isn't a modern invention or Western decadence. People claim her as an ancestor, a forerunner, proof it's always been around. But using her like that might twist what the bits actually show. Sappho wrote her stuff back in a day when ideas about gender, sexuality, marriage, and how society was set up were heaps different from now. Her story ain't a perfect match for modern lesbian experiences. The differences are just as important as the similarities. If you just see her as a stamp of approval, you're missing the whole unique historical background. But that yearning for connection, for a sense of heritage, for proof that people like us existed back in history, that's real and powerful. And Sappho gives us exactly that sort of evidence. She's one of the few sources where ancient female desire gets voiced from a woman's point of view. That makes her bloody valuable, even though the connection's complicated, and the fragments don't give us everything we want. These bits and pieces also matter because they show what poetry's all about and what language can do. Even in translation, Sappho's unique style comes through. Tight word choice, simple sentence structure, real imagery, hardly any abstract stuff. Instead of spelling out emotions, she shows physical stuff. Shivering, lost for words, sweaty palms. Rather than just saying someone's attractive, she gives you real details. An apple hanging from a branch, a purple dress, a young woman's laugh. That raw, in your face feeling. That precision, that way of leaning on images instead of explaining, it set the foundation for lyric poetry and influenced poets who came after. The modernists' thing for concrete images, showing instead of telling, letting readers make their own connections, all that comes from Sappho's style. Ezra Pound's imagism, HD's fragments, and modern poetry's love for brevity and suggestion over long-winded explanations, they're all connected to Sappho's vibe. Even if it's not always a direct influence, it comes from a shared understanding of what poetry should do. But most strikingly, these leftovers also show something about how art survives. Complete works can be judged, studied, and carefully looked after. Fragments make you get involved. They need to be deciphered. They won't let you just passively read. Getting into Sappho takes effort, creativity, and really engaging. You've got to fill in the gaps, make connections, and guess the missing words. That sort of active reading makes you feel like you're part of it. These bits kind of become yours because you've mentally filled in the holes. That could be why they've stuck around. They're not some shiny artifacts to admire from afar. Instead, they're endless puzzles, ongoing questions, infinite sources of possibility. Every reader, every translator, every scholar builds their own version of Sappho based on how they fill in the gaps. All these different Sapphos hang out together. None of them is the official one, the real one's missing. So what stays with us is this diversity, this whole mix of viewpoints. Everyone responding to the same busted-up clues in different ways. That's not a flaw in scholarship, it's just what the work is. Sappho basically lives on as interpretation, as reaction, as an ongoing chat about what these pieces mean and how they connect. Also, we've got to think about what gets lost when fragments are our main way into her work. Reading Sappho means reading something that's not finished. You never get the full poem, the fully expressed thought, or the complete structure. Every fragment cuts off mid-sentence, mid-image, mid-feeling. That gives you a particular artistic experience, one that favors suggestion over stating things directly, and inference over making outright claims. But that wasn't what Sappho originally had in mind. She wrote complete poems with beginnings, middles, and ends, with well-thought-out arguments, stories, and emotional arcs that came to a close. We don't have any of those, except for the hymn to Aphrodite. The rest is broken messages, partial reception, shattered writings. That matters because being broken has become so tied up with Sappho that it's hard to picture her work as whole. That broken quality feels like it's part of the art itself, not just an accident of survival. Modern poets deliberately copy the fragment style, writing poems that look like old papyrus scrolls, with brackets, dots, and bits missing. But this ain't a copy of Sappho's poetry itself. It's more like a reflection of what happened to her stuff over 2,000 years. Her original poems, the way she wrote them, were full whether they had 7 verses, 12, or however many the piece needed. Those poems started with a call, then developed, and wrapped up. They ticked the metrical boxes, fit the genre rules, and gave a proper ending. Coming across them like that would have been a totally different vibe. Nothing like the spooky gaps, the loaded silences, and the modern-style bits we see now. Back before modernism, lyric poems were just done, classy, and complete a feeling we can't get back. Heaps has been lost, but recognizing the difference is key. It stops us from romanticizing the loss and from thinking destruction was a creative choice. Some of the beauty of these bits is exactly in how broken they are. The gaps make our imagination work, and we get to be active players in making sense of things. But it's just a way of dealing with a massive loss, not a thumbs up for intentional art. Take fragment 16, for example, one of the longer bits that's still around. It starts by listing what different people reckon is the most beautiful. Some say cavalry, others say foot soldiers, still others say ships. But for me, it's the thing you love. Then the poem moves to Helen of Troy, as an example, the ultimate beauty who chucked everything for love. The fragment stops right in the middle of making that point. We miss out on the ending, the comeback to the first theme, and the final word about the loved one that would have wrapped up the idea. Without an ending, the poem feels modern and vague, leaving the reader to fill in the blanks. If the ending had survived, the poem would look more standard, clearer in structure, and rhetorically complete. Which version's better? Can't really tell because we've only got the broken one. The broken form has influenced modern poetry in ways the whole version might not have. The incompleteness gets its power from what's left unsaid. Check out fragment 31, which describes the physical feelings of wanting. The tongue gives out, fire runs under the skin, vision fails, ears ring with sound. The description is raw, immediate, and overwhelming, yet it also cuts off suddenly. It's not clear if there was a final verse that would have reflected on these feelings, explained them, or put them in a bigger picture. Maybe the poem just listed the sensations and then stopped. Or maybe it shifted towards resolution, understanding, or a plea. What the fragment gives us is intensity, without a resolution, a trait that feels really modern, but might just be luck rather than intent. This uncertainty runs through almost everything Sappho wrote. The rhythms she used in most of her poems are a mystery because we don't have enough lines in a row. The structure of her longer works is also unknown, since no full long pieces survive. Her creative range is still a mystery because most of her writings are gone. The 9 books of her poems, sorted by rhythm by the Alexandrian editors, originally had thousands of lines. What we've got are bits from a handful of poems out of a handful of books. The rest is silent. The surviving material makes up maybe 7% of her total work, and that tiny percentage is biased towards certain types because of how preservation happened to work. Love poems got quoted more often by later writers who were into emotional expression. Religious hymns, family poems, and one-off pieces meant for public shows didn't have as many quotable bits. Not as many standout lines that later authors wanted to reference, so they almost completely vanished. The Sappho we know today was already shaped by old editors' choices about what was worth keeping. Then it went through more filtering from medieval copying habits and the random survival of papyrus scrolls, each layer of selection changing the big picture. The Alexandrian editors picked and put together texts based on their own rules. Medieval scribes kept what grabbed their own attention or what their bosses wanted. Whether papyrus survived or got wrecked came down to environmental conditions in Egyptian rubbish dumps. None of these processes were meant to give us a fair sample of Sappho's work. What survived is just whatever luck and various biases allowed to stick around. So it's a bit dodgy making big claims about Sappho's poetry. When we say love and desire were her main gig, we're really talking about the bits that survived, not necessarily what she was really into. Maybe she knocked out just as much religious stuff, but them bits got quoted less often and didn't make it onto papyrus. Could be she wrote long political thoughts that disappeared completely because later editors reckoned they weren't as interesting. We can't pretend the evidence is there when it's not. What we can say for sure is that the bits we've got show off a bloody brilliant poetic mind. The language is spot on, tight, and efficient. Nothing's wasted. Every word pulls its weight. The images are concrete, not abstract, rooted in physical details. Instead of big philosophical talk, she shows rather than tells, using specific examples to get across bigger ideas. This clever trick is obvious, even in tiny little fragments. Fragment 105's got just 2 Greek words painting the moon going down. Only 2 words, but they call up a picture, set a mood, and suggest a scene. The brevity's unreal. Later, poets needed whole paragraphs to do what Sappho does with 2 words. That compression, that knack for packing heaps of meaning into a tiny bit of language, became a trademark of her style. This also makes translation a real headache. In Greek, a single word can carry implications that need whole sentences in other lingos. In English, the grammar allows meanings that English sentence structure just can't copy. The sound patterns, the rhythm, the musical feel of the language, none of that comes across nicely. Every translation's an interpretation, and every interpretation's incomplete. Plenty of legitimate translations can live side by side because the original has got potential that no one English version can totally nail. This variety in translation mirrors the variety of the fragments themselves. Same way, different translators give different takes on the same Greek bit. Different scholars come up with different ideas about what the fragments originally meant back in their day. All these versions hang around together, none final, all just guesses. And then there's the whole performance thing. Sappho's poems were meant to be sung, with a lyre playing along. But the music's completely gone. We've got no clue about the tunes, the beats, or how the words linked up with the music. Reading Sappho silently off a page is like reading an opera libretto. Without the music you get the words but miss half the art. Old stories talk about her performing, say she taught others to do her stuff, and mention how hearing these poems sung had a real emotional punch. None of that can be got back. We've got the lyrics but not the music, the words but not the show, the script but not the stage. Better than nothing, but still not the real deal. This matters for making sense of things, because some poetic choices make more sense when you consider they were performed. Repetition that looks over the top, when read might have had a musical reason. Line breaks that seem random on the page might match up with melody bits. The poems were written mainly for the ears, second for the eyes. Reading them silent turns that order upside down. Modern versions of Sappho's fragments sometimes throw in fresh music made up from what we know about ancient Greek music theory. These are educated guesses, trying to figure out what might have been. They're valuable as experiments, a way to hear the texts differently, but they're not real reconstructions. The original music's gone for good, along with heaps of other stuff. What's left is words on pages or screens, translations of bits of poems that were once whole and once performed live. These words, which were once right here, and now instead of old and distant, get read across a huge gap of time, language, culture, and context. It's pretty amazing that they still manage to communicate anything, that even with everything lost and all the hurdles, you can still hear a bit of Sappho's voice. When readers come across these fragments, they respond to that voice, not the academic stuff, not the historical background, not the language breakdown. It's the voice itself, the feel of a unique mind expressing itself in words with amazing clarity and power. Through these fragments, We get a peek into that mind, even if it's incomplete and roundabout, and it feels surprisingly current. Or maybe we've come to appreciate the poetic qualities that Sappho herself had. Those qualities include a focus on personal experience, emotional honesty, vivid real-life images, and being brief with hints instead of long-winded descriptions. Even though these are modern ideals, they were also right at the heart of Sappho's work. That connection isn't a coincidence. Modern poets have looked at Sappho's work, learned from it, and mixed her techniques into their own writing. Her work had a huge impact on 20th century poetry. Take H.D.'s fragments, they deliberately remind you of Sappho's style, and Ezra Pound's imagism owes a lot to her sharp imagery. Even poets who never mention Sappho by name often work in traditions she helped set up, the modern lyric poem. Focused on personal feelings expressed through vivid images and tight language, that's partly Sappho's legacy. But influence is complex, never just a simple handover. Poets don't just copy Sappho. They respond to her, push back against her, and tweak her methods to suit their own goals and situations. They make their own versions of what Sappho's poetry might mean, versions that are often miles away from anything Sappho herself would recognize. This means Sappho shows up in heaps of different forms all at the same time. The ancient poet whose full body of work is lost to us forever, the medieval character kept going through quotes and bits. The Renaissance comeback that shaped the European lyric tradition, the Victorian drama that needed careful explaining, the modernist muse for fresh poetry, the modern symbol whose sexuality is now a bigger deal than it was in her own time. Every era builds its own Sappho from the evidence that's left, focusing on different bits and making sense of the fragments through today's issues. The 2014 discovery of the brothers' poem shows this perfectly. Scholars already knew from old sources that Sappho had brothers called Charaxos and Larakos, that she'd written about Charaxos's thing with an Egyptian courtesan, and that family stuff came up in her poetry. But up to when that papyrus turned up, no known poem mentioning these brothers had survived. Everyone was really excited finally, personal details straight from Sappho's own words. Instead of relying on later commentators, people actually looked at it properly, and the disappointment was obvious. This wasn't the passionate love poetry Sappho was famous for. Instead, it gave household advice, family stuff, and hopes for a brother's success. The speaker seems worried and practical, caught up in everyday worries about whether Charaxos will come back with a full ship. She's also stressing about whether Larakos will turn into a decent bloke. This poem's handy as a biographical piece, giving us a look at Sappho's real life outside the love poetry. But by Sappho's own poetic standards, it's not all that great, and that shows a key truth. What we've got are Sappho's best works. The fragments survived because they were copied, quoted, and looked after over the centuries. The brothers' poem was saved by accident, buried in Egyptian rubbish. This gap in quality really matters. The fragments we treasure show Sappho at her best because those were the bits people chose to hold on to. The ordinary stuff was chucked out, forgotten, turned into mummy wrappings. That bias in what survived really shapes how we see her. The poems we've got from Sappho aren't exactly a fair sample of her work. Instead, they're bits that old-timey and medieval readers thought were worth holding on to, plus whatever else happened to stick around. So the picture we've got is pretty skewed towards erotic poetry, intense snippets, and pieces that shocked and fascinated people, who kept copying them even though the content was controversial. Truth is, her poetic range was probably a lot wider, because early mentions talk about wedding songs, hymns to gods, and poems about family and city life. Most of that's gone, so we're left with a view of Sappho as just a poet of love and lust. Whether that's how she saw herself or how her mates understood her work is anyone's guess. The legend about her death just makes the distortion worse. The story that she chucked herself off the cliffs of Leucadia because she was madly in love with a bloke named Phaon shows up in writings hundreds of years after she kicked the bucket. It's almost certainly made up, probably from people misreading her poems. Back in the day, comedy writers loved making up scandalous life stories for famous people. So Sappho got a dramatic, lovesick death to match her fiery love poems. Modern scholars reckon the Phaon tale is a myth, but it sticks in people's heads because it's a ripper story. The top romance poet dies for the sake of romance. Never mind that she probably lived to a ripe old age. The poems we've got show someone thinking about getting old and dying, not doing a dramatic leap off a cliff. The myth's more dramatic than the truth. What we actually know about her life comes mostly from a poem about her brother and a few mentions in later texts. She was from Lesbos, part of a wealthy family that was into local politics. She was forced into exile, probably during some political drama around 600 BCE. She hung out in Sicily for a while and eventually came back to her home island. Maybe she had a daughter named Claeus, but that's iffy too, because the relevant bit can be read differently. Her husband's name, given in old texts as Kirkolos of Andros, is almost certainly a joke. The word Kyklos looks like a shortened version of a word for Willie, and Andros could mean the island or of man. So basically an ancient version of a rude name like Dick Olcock. In the same crude style, comedy writers made up silly names for historical figures. Sappho ended up with a hubby whose name is basically a dirty joke, showing that even back then people were making stuff up about her life. To fit the mold of what a woman poet's life should look like, they had to give her a husband when they didn't know his real name. So they made one up, and that made-up name shows how awkward they felt. How do you explain a woman getting famous for writing in a society that didn't let women do much in public? The Thyasos idea gave one possible answer. Apparently, Sappho ran a kind of finishing school for posh girls, teaching them music, poetry, and manners. That picture makes her seem proper and gives her a traditional female role as a mentor to young women. The problem is, none of her poems that we have back that up. Later scholars made it up to make Sappho seem respectable, to explain away the homoerotic bits as educational rather than romantic. Modern research has knocked down the finishing school idea, realizing it was cooked up to tidy up Sappho's sexuality. Her poems talk about desire, longing, jealousy, and passion. Treating these poems as just teaching materials means ignoring their emotional punch. It's more honest to say, we don't fully get the social setup that let Sappho's poetry happen, and that our modern categories don't line up neatly with ancient realities. The question of her sexuality stays controversial precisely because it matters a lot to today's audience. Sappho, as a symbol of lesbian identity, plays important cultural roles, giving historical backup to identities that often get knocked back. Saying she's definitely gay has political weight. Sticking modern identity labels onto old writings creates a whole bunch of inaccuracies. Back in ancient Greece, they didn't have our idea of sexual orientation as something that defines who you are. The way they classified stuff was completely different. Trying to figure out for sure if Sappho was a lesbian by today's standards might be going about it the wrong way. It's pretty clear that Sappho's poetry shows she was into women. That longing is a key part of a lot of her surviving work. And back then, audiences knew it too, even if they weren't happy about it. Since the writings are all fragmentary, you can read them in a bunch of different ways at once. You could see the poems as romantic passion, teacher-student affection, spiritual devotion, or some tricky mix of all that. The bits that are gone let people take different meanings from them. That openness keeps Sappho culturally relevant. Every generation finds new ideas in what's left. Sappho's influence on later poetry comes from both direct borrowing and creative reimagining. Around 100 BC, Catullus translated Fragment 31, the one about physical signs of desire, into Latin. Catullus changed the love interest from a woman to a bloke, tweaking Sappho's words to show straight desire. That set a trend. Later poets used her techniques, but often swapped the genders around. The Sapphic stanza, a rhythm named after her, became a standard form in Latin and later in European poetry and local lingos. Horace used it a fair bit, and it pops up all through medieval and Renaissance works. From the 1500s on, English poets had a go at squeezing the Sapphic stanza into English poetic beats. The form outlasted Sappho's original poems, floating around independently of them. Back in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, people knew Sappho mainly through her rep and from bits quoted in other books. They knew she was the top female poet of ancient times, that Plato called her the 10th muse, and that her work was all about love and desire. From that slim info, they probably only had a few complete poems and heaps of random lines quoted in grammar and rhetoric textbooks. They came up with their own ideas of what her poetry meant. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, papyrus discoveries massively expanded the known collection. Suddenly, heaps of new fragments turned up, some big enough to give a real sense of whole poems. Scholars got a bit wild-excited but also knackered as they tried to piece together and edit these scraps. One researcher actually went blind from the intense effort of studying those fragile papyrus manuscripts. One academic apparently had a temporary mental meltdown because of these discoveries. That changed how people saw Sappho, She became a real poet instead of a mythical figure known mainly through gossip. Sappho came into focus as a writer whose genuine work could be studied, interpreted, and translated. Even though what was left was still broken and incomplete, it gave enough material for proper scholarly analysis. The translations that came out reflected the prejudices and aims of the people doing them. Victorian versions often sanitized the stuff or played up the artistic qualities while downplaying the sexy bits. Modernist translators from the early 1900s emphasized how fragmentary the works were, presenting them as broken relics that reflected modernist fragmentation. Then later, feminist translators focused on recovering female viewpoints and life stories from the bloke-dominated historical records. Every translation is also a bit of interpretation. You've got to make calls about how to put ancient Greek into modern English, what bits to highlight, what to explain, and how to handle the dodgy passages. None of these translations are neutral or definitive. Each one is basically an argument about Sappho's importance, what her works mean, and how we should tackle them. The whole thing is riddled with questions about authenticity. How can we be sure a particular fragment actually came from Sappho? Ancient experts sometimes credited stuff to her that probably came from other writers. Back in the Middle Ages, scribes chucked in their own errors. These days, editors sometimes throw together bits from different sources to make composite works that might not match any complete poem Sappho actually wrote. Scholarly tools try to sort this out. Different fragments get different levels of certainty. Some are dead-set genuine, saved in reliable old citations from ancient times. Some were probably written by Sappho, but don't have absolute proof. Others might be hers, or could come from other poets of her time, using similar styles. This uncertainty is bloody frustrating, but unavoidable given the evidence we've got. With all those warnings and doubts in mind, what's left is a bunch of poems that still move readers even though they're incomplete. The hymn to Aphrodite still works as a prayer to the goddess of love. Fragment 31 keeps describing the physical feeling of longing with amazing accuracy. The apple bit still brings desire to mind with its simple images. These effects don't need whole poems or certain attributions. They work through what's really there on the page. Sappho's lasting influence isn't really about the details of her life we can't fully recover or the complete poems we'll never read. It's about the bits that survived, the words that still hit home after 2,600 years. You get this sense of a unique mind expressing itself through words, with incredible strength and skill. That mind feels amazingly close, even with huge gaps in how it was passed down, even with all we've lost, even with all the layers of interpretation. Modern readers come at Sappho through different filters: translations, scholarly editing, cultural biases, today's concerns. We can't read her straight up. We can't know for sure what she meant or how her first audience got her work. Still, we can connect with what's left and reckon it's amazing. The leftovers make a unique kind of poetry, beautiful precisely because they're incomplete, powerful because they suggest so much more than they say. That's the weird gift of incomplete works. They get you involved, force you to think creatively, leave room for readers to fill in what's missing. Sappho's poems as we have them today are a collaboration between her old language and our modern reading. Those gaps turn into creative spaces, where meaning comes alive through the back and forth between text and reader. That wasn't Sappho's original plan. She wrote complete poems for specific performances, but intention doesn't control how a work is received. The bits we've got now have a life of their own, separate from what they were originally for. They've turned into something new, through the process of being passed down and falling apart. When we read Sappho, what we get is just as much her creation as it is history's creation, poetry shaped by time, chance, and survival. The voice we hear is real, the result of one person writing under specific circumstances. But it's also made up, stitched together from leftovers, translated across languages, seen through modern eyes. Both truths exist at the same time. That's the puzzle of reading ancient poetry. You need a double vision to see both the original work and the version that's been passed down, to admit the distance, but still connect with what speaks across it. The ultimate discovery won't change what matters most, whether we find 10 more fragments or none at all. Sappho lives on as the evidence shows, someone who turned desire into words with unmatched precision, who lifted personal experience into art. She wrote poems so powerful they were copied for 700 years, despite social backlash, language barriers, and changing tastes. 2,600 years separate us from her time, and that gap is huge. We can't hear her poems sung with a lyre, and we can't see them performed in their original setting. For context, we don't fully understand the social systems that allowed her to create. 93% of her work is lost to us. But 650 lines survived against all odds, making it through fires, floods, and deliberate destruction as they went from papyrus to parchment to print to digital, through dead languages, religions that condemned her, and empires that rose and fell. These lines stuck around because they meant something to folks in every age. People ran into them and chose to copy them instead of letting them disappear. That choice happened heaps of times over thousands of years. Whenever anyone jotted down a bit, translated a poem, or quoted a line in an academic paper, they were backing Sappho's continued survival. This survival wasn't automatic or guaranteed. It needed repeated preservation efforts by people who saw value in these old writings. What they held onto shows a key part of what poetry does. Sappho didn't write philosophical essays or history books. Instead, she wrote poems about desire, beauty, longing, sorrow, personal stuff that mattered to her, and obviously to readers over the centuries too. When you use precise words and vivid images, the personal turns universal. Fragment 31 still nails jealousy better than most modern poems. The physical signs, the rush of feelings, the sense of falling apart while watching someone you fancy talk to another person that hasn't changed, our bodies still react the same. That 2,500-year gap disappears when you see your own experience in her words. The fragments work because they're based on real, specific details, not vague ideas. The apple on the highest branch, the moon going down while someone lies alone, the signs of desire listed with almost medical accuracy. These pictures go beyond their original setting because they're grounded in physical truths that stay the same over time. Modern poetry owes her a lot, often without saying so. The focus on real images, on showing not telling, on keeping it concise and efficient with language, on personal experience being a legitimate topic. These became core principles partly thanks to Sappho's example, not always through direct influence, but through a tradition she helped start that shaped how lyric poetry developed. Being fragmentary brought something unexpected. The gaps make you read actively, use your imagination, and get involved. You can just admire a complete poem passively, but fragments demand teamwork between the old text and today's reader. You've got to fill in the silences. Imagine what's missing. Build meaning from the bits. And that makes every meeting with Sappho a bit different. What you bring to the fragments decides what you find in them. Different readers, various translators, and all sorts of scholars each make their own versions based on how they fill the gaps. All these versions exist together. None is the final word or just temporary. That kind of variety is perfect for a poet whose whole works are gone. We can't get back the original. So what's left is interpretation, reaction, and an ongoing chat about what these bits might mean. This discussion has gone on for 2,600 years. It won't stop. New fragments might pop up. Technology gets better. Collections get digitized. Private stuff comes to light. The archive isn't shut. But even without new finds, the fragments we've got produce endless interpretations, translations, and adaptations. They're inexhaustible because they're incomplete, productive exactly because they don't let themselves be wrapped up. The real story of Sappho's life is mostly unknown. We've got bits of info, likely details, and legends that are definitely false. The woman herself is hidden behind her work. What remains is the voice, the mind expressing itself through words with rare directness and force. That voice speaks across the huge gap of time, culture, language, and setting. It speaks through damaged papyrus, unclear authorship, and many translations. It speaks in bits that cut off mid-thought, mid-picture, mid-feeling, but it speaks. The miracle isn't that we understand everything. The miracle is that we've got anything at all. Back around 600 BC, on some Greek island, someone carved words that somehow made it all the way to the 21st century. These bits and pieces held on against all the odds. People trying to wreck them, accidents, and just plain being ignored. They lasted because the quality's top-notch, and the language did stuff readers wanted to keep, even when they didn't agree with what it was about. The pictures it paints are dead set, unforgettable. The feelings ring true, no matter how many years pass. What's left of her work is maybe just 7% of everything Sappho ever wrote. That 7%, the rest's gone, wrecked, disappeared into the dust of the Med, but it changed poetry forever. It showed how powerful personal songs can be, How one person's story can speak to everyone if you use the right words and vivid pictures. It proved a woman's voice could get the same respect as Homer's. Back then, they called her the 10th muse, put her face on coins, and quoted her stuff for 700 years. Then most of it got lost. All that was left was scraps, bits pulled out of rubbish dumps and mummy wrappings. Enough to show what we'd lost and prove that something amazing was once there. This tiny bit is all we've got, but it's enough. Poetry doesn't have to be complete to work. It needs language that hits hard, clear images that make you get it, and a real voice. Sappho's bits do all that, even though they're wrecked. The apple on the highest branch, the moon going down while someone's on their own, the physical signs of wanting, all captured with amazing precision. These images work because they're based on stuff we still get. Our bodies don't change. Wanting works the same way, and loneliness feels just as crap now as it did thousands of years ago. Sappho found words that match these experiences, didn't explain or theorize, just showed, grabbed hold, and made it real. That achievement still stands, even though it's all broken up, translated, and handed down through 2,600 years of being passed on and lost. The voice we hear in these bits feels both ancient and right here, right now. It feels old, because it comes from a world totally different to ours. A society with its own rules about gender, sex, religion, politics, everything. But it feels immediate, because it talks about experiences and feelings that don't change, that go beyond any specific time. This two-sided thing is what makes the fragments so powerful. They're both far off and near, strange but familiar, lost and found again. To read them, you gotta keep a few different perspectives at once. Get the history but see the modern links. Accept what's missing while appreciating what's there. They teach us that art doesn't last through perfect preservation. Nah. It sticks around because heaps of people passed it on. Not because some institution said so, but because individuals chose to copy it instead of binning it. Their survival was never a sure thing. It took countless little decisions over centuries, and those decisions gave us what we've got now. The 650 lines we still have are bloody amazing poetry, bits that show a thinking mind, a consciousness expressing itself through ridiculously skilled language, a voice that echoes through time despite everything trying to stop it. Sappho wrote 10,000 verses. We've got less than 7% of them, and losing the rest is a tragedy. That any of it still around is a miracle. Both of those things are true. The disaster makes the miracle even more incredible, that anything survived at all. That these particular bits made it through the centuries when so much didn't. That we can still read words carved 2,600 years ago and find them moving, surprising, and relevant. The fragments won't give us everything we want. They won't answer every question about Sappho's life, beliefs, or relationships. Her world will stay unfinished, damaged, unclear. But they'll keep speaking to anyone willing to listen, to fill in the gaps, to get involved in making meaning from what's left. That's what it's like to deal with ancient poetry. You work with leftovers, accept it's incomplete, build understanding from bits and pieces, knowing the whole thing's gone. But even with all the hurdles and everything that got lost, something still manages to get through. A voice, an awareness, the presence of someone who lived, wrote, and was important enough that others kept on transcribing her work. Over the centuries, Sappho's work has survived mostly as fragmented bits. These fragments remain because people chose to keep them instead of throwing them away. That choice gets renewed whenever anyone reads her writing, translates a poem, teaches the fragments, or writes about her impact. The process of passing things on keeps going. The voice keeps sounding, and the words keep finding new audiences ready to fill in the gaps. The conversation between an ancient work and a modern audience can't and won't ever stop. The fragments are still there for everyone, fertile and endless. Every new generation discovers different meanings, hones in on different bits, and comes up with their own interpretations. All these interpretations hang out together, enriching words that have built up meaning over thousands of years. Sappho's real inheritance isn't the complete collection we'll never see. It's the surviving pieces that truly matter. What we have is that voice still ringing through ruin and absence, along with proof that someone 26 centuries ago did something amazing with language. That achievement is still obvious despite the fragments, the translations, and all the barriers between her era and ours. The bits and pieces pulled from Egyptian rubbish tips changed poetry, showed new directions that later poets checked out and built on, and proved that personal life could produce significant art that individual voices mattered, and that women could write with just as much force as men. These are no small feats. And the fragments also get us thinking about what's been lost, not just Sappho's full collection, but countless other voices that completely failed to survive. Women writers whose work wasn't kept, poets whose creations seemed less important to those old compilers, views that didn't line up with what later times wanted to keep. The record is full of gaps. Yet Sappho survived in pieces, enough to show what once was there. Enough to show that brilliant poetry was alive and well in ancient times. It was composed by someone whose voice still echoes, if you're up for hearing it, through all the interference of age, decay, and language conversion. Ultimately, it's that voice that matters, not the biographical details we can never check, nor the complete poems we can never look at. The voice emerges from the remnants, speaking with accuracy and strength about passion, beauty, loss, and longing. The awareness that came through skillful language, so that people kept transcribing the text across the ages, despite social opposition and churchly censure. The words endured, despite overwhelming odds, facing both deliberate destruction and accidental loss. They got through the shift from spoken performance to written record, to printed edition to digital format. They also survived dead languages, fallen empires, and religions that condemned her. The words lasted because they were remarkable, and they're still remarkable. Fragment 31 still captures envy with startling accuracy. Fragment 16 still argues that desire is supreme. The hymn to Aphrodite still works as both a prayer and a poem at once. The apple fragment still stirs, longing through its plain picture. These effects don't rely on being whole, they work through the content that is present. Sappho wrote verses 26 centuries ago on an island in the Aegean. Most of it went missing. But what stuck around was enough to change how poetry works, to influence authors for over 2,000 years, and to offer proof that women's expressions carry weight. It also showed that individual experience can become universal through precise wording. The fragments are all we have, but they're also all we need.